In this video, I want to take a look at cap plastic and specifically how it's applied to mould surfaces when it's used for making prosthetics. Cap plastic has been used for making ball caps when you want people to look like they've got no hair, which I don't need. But it's used for years for making ball caps for that kind of thing, and it's more recently been used for making the surfaces or an encapsulant for prosthetic appliances, particularly silicone gel filled appliances, which are very soft, and that softness means they're very, very sticky, and it becomes an unworkable surface. You can't apply glue to it really, and makeup doesn't stick to it. So what we need is an intermediary surface that will connect the silicone to the glues or to the makeup, and so often cap plastic has been used for this. It's usually applied either with a conventional brush like this or with an airbrush. And they both have their pros and cons, and what I want to do in this video is look at how an airbrush is used, the kind of airbrushes and compressors that you might use, but also to compare the results of cap plastic which has been applied using both a conventional brush and an airbrush, so you can see the two results side by side. So this is a selection of airbrushes that I have, and I use them for different things, mostly for painting, but I have pressed some of them into service for using with cap plastic. The ones I use for painting mostly are things like this little Grex airbrush, which is quite nice, and my iWater Eclipse, which I'm very, very happy with. I've had this for about 12 years and or maybe more, and only changed a few parts in it, and it's held me, in good stead. It's a great little airbrush for painting, but it's a little bit impractical for a lot of cap plastic applications. Both of these airbrushes are gravity fed, and by that I mean the fluid goes into this little pot at the top and comes down with gravity, so you have to kind of hold it and then spray like that. And because of obviously the weight of anything that would be on top, it's impractical to have too much. So these smaller airbrushes are great for painting, but not particularly good for cap plastic. The ones I tend to use for cap plastic are these, and these are all siphon feed airbrushes. So at the top here we have another iWater. This is an iWater Revolution, a couple of Pachets. This is the Pachet H and the Pachet VR. So this is the single action, and that's dual action. And these are just a couple of cheap airbrushes that I got from like a tool shop or a hardware store. So these are very inexpensive, but for cap plastic they're actually pretty good, and I use these mostly for painting. But for airbrush cap plastic and stuff, I think the one I would go to normally if I'm going to do anything refined is probably this Pachet H. I've swapped out, this was Todd's idea, and it's a really, really cool one. Instead of using the grub screw in here with an Allen key, I just use one that has a thumb screw. So that makes changing this nozzle out and cleaning much, much easier because you don't need a tool to do it. Now, airbrushes like this are great because they will provide you with a reasonable amount of accuracy for sort of neater, smaller paint jobs, but you can also swap in these larger bottles. So if you've got a lot of cap plastic to do, a container like this is much, much easier, and you can also get larger bottles as well. So that gives you a lot more options in terms of spraying large volumes of cap plastic. And for cap plasticking, these kinds of airbrushes, as you can see, are just much more practical than something like this, which is not really going to hold much at all, and you'll be emptying that out and changing it every few seconds. So I would much rather spray something of a reasonable size with this, but if you need to go bigger than this, then even this kind of airbrush isn't really practical for a lot of painting of cap plastic. For much larger quantities of cap plastic spraying, I would use something known as an HVLP gun. One this size is probably a bit too heavy duty, it's a bit too big. It'll work, but as you can see, it's a much, much larger airbrush and just contains a lot of stuff. So if you're spraying a huge amount of something, then this may be okay, but I tend to use more often than not this kind of tool here. So this was an airbrush gun or a paint gun. It's from Amazon, and it was about £25, I think. So it wasn't expensive, and as you can see, it's got a decent sized container on the top, a big size needle in here which is going to let a lot of cap plastic through, and it doesn't get clogged almost ever, and when it does get clogged I just flush it through with some acetone. So it's a very, very effective air gun for that kind of thing. You can change the spray patterns by rotating the thing at the top, which you get a much more practical shaped spray pattern. So when you're spraying a mould, it'll actually spray in a kind of a fan, in a flat kind of arc of cap plastic, which gives you a much, much more precise and sensible shape for spraying moulds, particularly flat moulds. And these are good. The only thing you need to worry about, obviously, is the amount of air that it requires to use one of these properly. Now, this being an HVLP gun, like I say, that stands for high volume, low pressure. So the volume of air that's going to come through here is much, much greater than you would get with a conventional airbrush. And you can see when you compare it to something like the smaller Grex, that it just doesn't compete in terms of how much volume you can hold. But like I say, the amount of air that can chuck out of the end of this airbrush, you obviously need a lot more air feeding into it. So you need to look at the compressor that you're going to be using. This kind of compressor for this kind of thing, you could use a smaller little, compressor that you would normally use for painting with an airbrush, but it's not going to provide the volume that you need. It's not the pressure we're so worried about, but the volume. So for conventional airbrushes, you tend to use these kinds of hoses, and these kind of hoses work fine. But again, you may need to get some adapters if you need to modify it to fit your compressor. So this is the kind of average kind of fitting you would get for a compressor fitting. And on here, this is my Pache airbrush, but I had to swap out a different kind of nozzle to attach the end of that hose to it. So you can get adapters of all kinds for this kind of thing, and I think it's a good idea generally to keep a lot of adapters and just general adapters and modifiers that you can change, because you never know if you change workshops or if you're working in a different environment or a different country, there may be different kinds of fittings that you need. For the compressor that I tend to be using for my bigger airbrushes, I'm going to need this kind of fitting, which is like a quick change sort of push fit. And this is a Euro adapter. You can get different kinds in different countries. So check which ones you're going to be needing where you are, but it's perfectly feasible you may end up working somewhere else. So I think it's good to have a range of different fittings that will fit different compressors, so that wherever you go, you've got something that will adapt and change, and it's just something to keep like a first aid kit. You never know when you're going to need it. So like I say, if these kind of hoses are the hoses you're used to using with your conventional airbrush, you may find you need to upgrade to something a little bit more heavy duty when it comes to actually using a bigger air gun. So something like an HVLP spray gun is going to need something like this, which is quite hefty. I think this is like a 10mm bore tube in here, and it's pressure rated for much higher pressures than your conventional small little airbrush. The other thing that's different is obviously it's going to have usually these quick fit adapters in here, and they normally just clip together, and then to release them you pull them apart. But you may need to get this in addition to your airbrush bits and bobs if your compressor doesn't come with it. I think I paid about £20 for this. They vary in price depending on quality and what kind of levels of pressure you're expecting to put up with, but I think between £20 and £25, or your financial equivalent, wherever that is in the world where you are, is about right for this kind of air gun. This one, I think it's about 10 meters long. I wanted to get a decent length of tubing so that I could use it in the workshop and get the air gun to other places in the workshop without having to tote around a big heavy compressor. So that would just go in there like that, and then you click it together, and then to release, pop it off. So this is the kind of compressor that most people think of when they are doing airbrushing, and this kind of compressor will easily work with this size airbrush, so there's nothing wrong with it. But for the larger guns, you're going to find you just need something with a bit more guts that can pump out more air. So on this little compressor, it's only got 1/5 horsepower, which is not an amazingly powerful compressor, but it's perfectly good for what we need for conventional painting. And the thing that we're interested in here is the litres per minute. So because this is using metric measurements, it's using litres per minute, which is in this case 23 litres per minute. So you may need to do some conversions depending on where you are in the world and what kind of measurements you use. So here you can see my two compressors side by side for comparison. So the one on the right, which is the 23 litres per minute, which is much smaller. It's very portable and very light, but it's not nearly capable of producing enough air for what we need for the bigger air guns. Let's compare the larger compressor specs with the smaller one. Now here you can see I've got a 1.1 horsepower motor, which is much more powerful, and the amount of air it can produce per minute is 165 litres. So that's 165 litres a minute compared to the 23 litres a minute of the other smaller compressor. So you can see there's a world of difference between these two. And one aspect you may not have thought about with a larger compressor is to check the amount of sound it creates when it's being used. Because if it sounds like an aircraft taking off every time you switch it on, that might be something you need to worry about if you're going to be working in an environment where sound is going to be an issue. So regardless of what cap plastic you use, it will come usually in a bottle like this, and it is a liquid, but it will need thinning in order to go through an airbrush and be painted on, so it's quite concentrated. Regardless of the alcohol or acetone base, it's the same issue. And if you want to spray it with an airbrush, it'll give you a much nicer finish. but you will need to thin it quite considerably to get it to go through the airbrush, and then you'll have to build up several layers to get it the right thickness. But what I want to do is show you first how you can do it with a paintbrush, but just to make you aware of some of the problems that can happen when you use a conventional brush to paint in cat plastic into a mould. So here, for example, is a mould that I made. It's made in silicone. It's a little powdery because it's just been talked when it was pulled out of the mould. But as you can see, it's good to go. It's made in red silicone, so it should show up quite nicely when I paint my cat plastic on. So to paint the cat plastic in, I'm just going to use this very thin fan brush. And the reason I like to use these is because the bristles are fine, so it's not going to aggravate the surface too much when you're painting successive layers. So what I'm going to do is paint on some cat plastic that I've thinned. This is about 6 or 7 parts acetone to 1 part cat plastic. So what I'm doing is I'm painting it in, and as you can see, it kind of collects into the deep areas. Now I've picked up some of the talc when I'm brushing it on, which isn't really a problem, but it's something to be aware of, that you want to make sure your mould is clean before you begin. And obviously by painting it on with a conventional brush like this, you can see we need to make sure we get it into the deep areas and the recesses, because otherwise the brush just kind of skims over the high points and misses the low points. But what will often happen when you paint it in with a brush like this is that you'll see that it kind of collects in pools, it kind of puddles in the deep areas and evaporates very quickly off the high areas where the cat plastic is thinnest. So the danger is you end up with a sort of a surplus in the deepest areas, and by contrast at the very, very high points here, which will be the lowest points of the piece, but with the moulds the other way around, these high points, they'll evaporate much, much quicker. And the danger of that is then you end up with a cat plastic surface which isn't consistent. So these high points, these very high edges, will be much, much thinner or non-existent. So when you come to peel this piece out, you actually find that it separates along those ridge lines. And here you can see what I mean by it kind of collecting in the sort of deeper areas. In the recesses, it just really pools up, and you end up with a very sort of inconsistent layer because it's obviously much, much deeper in these areas here and doesn't dry as quick. So you have to kind of make sure it doesn't pool in those deeper areas. So one possible way around this is to kind of paint it in and just make sure that it runs out of those recessy areas like this by letting it drip back into a container so you don't waste it. And you make sure it doesn't kind of sit in those deep areas too much, because if you let it pool, it could take a long, long time to dry. The other issue which you can see here is that because I've got to move the mould around and actually handle it during painting, that means my thumbs kind of get stuck to it, and now as you can see the cat plastic is kind of stuck to my thumb. So actually handling the piece is a lot trickier this way, because like I say, you don't want to have to touch it if you don't need to. When you get areas like this that have been damaged, you can just use the same cat plastic mixture to kind of melt away damaged bits and just repair them with the same stuff. But it does mean you end up with a kind of a lumpy, textured kind of finish. So when you're using a conventional brush like this to paint the cat plastic on, you've got to be very careful to get everywhere without reactivating the previous layers, because that's the trouble. If you keep wiping it consistently in the same spot like this, you're not actually accumulating layers, you're just wiping away the previous layers, because the acetone that's in it will just reactivate the previous layers that you painted on. So you've got to be quite quick when you do this. Paint it on and try not to agitate it too much. Let it dry and then go again. But as you can see, getting a brush into these deeper areas is tricky. And I'm using a wide brush deliberately because I want to be able to cover the surface quickly. If I had a narrow brush, I'd have to paint it a lot more times, which means I'm going to keep touching it. So you want to try and minimize how much you touch the mold and be swift as you kind of brush over the surface. But in so doing, it's inevitable you're going to leave little pools of it in these deeper areas, which is not going to give you the most consistent or nicest finish. So it's been a few minutes, and as you can see, it's pretty much dried, although when you paint cat plastic on with a brush, it tends to have a slight gloss to it, but it goes matte when you airbrush it. But even though it's pretty much dry, you can see there's some deep areas there in the middle, for example, where the acetone still hasn't evaporated. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to speed the whole thing up with a hair dryer and just put another layer on top, and then I'll call that done. And then we'll see how that looks when we peel that out. Okay, one more layer. It's worth saying you want to sort of re-dip the brush every so often. You don't want to try and make one brush load be the entire amount that you're going to spread over the surface, because that way you're making a very, very thin layer and you're asking a lot of that small amount of cap plastic. So I'll keep re-dipping my brush every second or so just to make sure that I am laying more cap plastic on the surface. Okay, so that's another layer, and I'll dry this off. So that's pretty much all done. What I will do is now leave this for an hour or two to completely evaporate, and then we'll come back and check how that cap plastic looks. What I'm going to do is I'll peel the cap plastic out without any silicone, just so you can see how the cap plastic would appear, and then we'll compare that with the airbrush version. So this is an identical mould. It's exactly the same piece, but this time I'm going to spray in some cap plastic, and for this first attempt, or this first layer, I'm going to use my Iwater, which I'm very happy with, the Iwater Eclipse, and I'm going to try this with some thinned down cap plastic, about 6 parts acetone to 1 part cap plastic. So what I'll do is I'll pour some of my mixture into the airbrush, and then we'll just check to see that it's actually working, and it is. What I tend to do is a little bit of a cheat to help things along a bit, is I will pull the needle out just a touch and then lock it off again so that more can actually come out from the end. All right, let's try this out. So that's one layer done with the airbrush, and as you can see, I'm not having to touch the surface. The layer it's putting down is much, much finer, and so it dries instantly, and it's an even coat everywhere. So the deep areas and the high points each will catch a little bit. You can see a kind of a frosting effect on some of the high points where it's drying. You may even get some very slight cobwebbing, but that can just be overcome by thinning your mix a bit more, or just spraying some acetone over the top just to kind of knock all that back. But as you can see, it's a pretty quick, efficient way. One thing I would note though with the airbrush that I'm using, as you can see, the amount of cap plastic that's in there is used half of it already just in one layer, so I'd have to keep refilling this, especially if it was a bigger mold. The other thing is obviously that it's a very narrow path. If I spray again, what I'll do is I'll rotate it 90 degrees so my next layer cross hatches, so I tend to spray the opposite way. But when I spray this on, you'll see it's a very narrow band that it's actually spraying, so it takes many, many, many layers to go all over this, and that's going to take time. And again, if you're in a bit of a hurry and you've got a lot of molds to paint, time might be something you don't have. And if it's a large mold or very complicated sculpt, the danger is that because it's such a narrow spray pattern, you might just miss somewhere, or at least be thinner in some areas than others. So what I am going to do is sort of knock it up another notch and use a HVLP gun instead, and you can see how that compares. So for this, I'm going to pour some of my mixture into this cup, pop the lid on so we don't get any spills, and again we'll just check the spray. So we can change the direction, and we can also reduce the pressure. Okay, let's try that. A bit more fierce, as you can see, but it's also much, much quicker. Now if the mixture's too thick, we can always thin it down with a bit more acetone, so the amount of cap plastic that we're laying down is reduced. So as you can see, a lot more waste because it's overspraying. So we just need to tweak our mixture and our air mix so that we don't use too much. Obviously, if you've got a lot of moulds lined up, this is a really, really good tool for that because you can cover a lot of ground very quickly. And now let's try the same thing with the Pache H. So once all the cap plastic is completely dried and the acetone has evaporated away, we can then fill our piece with silicone. So normally at this stage I'd fill the silicone in here and scrape it back. What I want to do is just show you the cap plastic. So this one was sprayed, but it was quite thin. I didn't spray enough maybe as I would like, but it's not too bad. But when I stretch the cap plastic off, you can actually see that it is a complete skin of cap plastic. It hasn't missed those high points. So here when I pull this up, you can see even though it's really, really thin, it's a consistent skin. I mean, it could probably do another couple of layers because when I stretch it out, you can actually see the tiny little holes that are in it. So for that reason, it probably needs maybe thinning so that it was a slightly thinner mix and an extra couple of layers so it doesn't end up being too thick. But you can see that it's a consistent layer the whole way over. So here are these two molds again. So this one on the left hand side, this is with the airbrush, and on this side here we have the one that was done with the paintbrush. So let's have a look and compare the two. So when I pull away the cap plastic like we did before, you can see even on those edges it's given us a nice consistent skin all over, and that's really what we're after, is to try and get a nice even skin. So this is probably a little bit thicker than it needs to be, but you can see when I pull it away that it's completely an even skin all over, right over those edges. It's a little bit thinner on those lines. You can just about see where those lines are, but it is a consistent skin the whole way across. So let's have a look at the one that was painted on with a brush. So it's definitely set, which is nice. It's all dried off nicely, and it's got a reasonably good skin, but you can see here when I pull it that it's actually really thin on those high points. So when I'm trying to pull this piece out, if this was full of silicone, you could see that the cap plastic would separate along this line, which would mean the flashing was no longer attached. And the reason for that, like I say, is because on those high points, that's where the cap plastic just run away. Also, you can see it's a little bit inconsistent in its thickness. And even on the inside here, you've got little holes where the cap plastic was on the highest points where it's just completely run away. And so they would separate out. By comparison, this is the airbrushed one. As you can see when I lift it away, there's no holes in the middle. The whole thing remains attached and consistent. So overall, you're going to get a much nicer finish using the airbrush than you will a conventional paintbrush. I hope that was useful. Thanks for watching, and please, if you're interested in more prosthetic stuff, you want to see some more information and some cool chats, check out our podcast, Battles with Bits of Rubber. It's found wherever there are podcasts.